the author of Baddawi. And just as a quick synopsis of the novel, she's going to be discussing basically her process of, following her father's journey as a Palestinian refugee in the Camp Baddawi in Lebanon throughout the Civil War, and then his immigration onward, and sort of the trials and tribulations he felt and experienced during that. So she's just going to talk a little bit about her own process and the history behind that. We're going to have time for a question and answer session after, and if anybody wants to discuss the book with her after or have a signed copy, she'll be around after to do that. I'll just let her tell the story.
I guess I'll just start by talking a little bit about the history of the project itself. When I first started drawing these comics, it was just kind of like, it was like winter break of my freshman year of college, and I was bored, and I just started drawing little individual stories of my dad's life, like stories that my brother and I had always heard growing up about him living in the camps or him during the Civil War, and just putting them like on a WordPress blog and posting them like to my Facebook. And I was doing that for a while, and then eventually I guess somebody at Just World Books got a hold of it, and they asked if I wanted to make it into a whole graphic novel. So I kind of got like thrown into it and was like not really sure totally about like what I was doing in the beginning, and had like all these individual stories, little vignettes that were all disconnected from each other in a way, because they were only little stories that I had just been putting up on the blog. And so then I started working on the project, and it was like, what I was trying to do was find a way to weave all those individual stories together and start creating like a whole narrative out of it, and find a way to make it into one cohesive thing instead of a bunch of little pieces. And so when I started, it was really just like me wanting to share like stories that my brother and I had heard, stories that we had grown up hearing, like I said, and stories, the reason that it was important to me is because these stories are really, in a lot of households, in a lot of Palestinian households, they're almost common stories. It's like everybody hears this, their parents talking about life growing up back home. But those stories are not often heard by people outside of those families and outside of those communities. So even though it wasn't such a unique story, it was a unique one to people outside of our community or outside of the Palestinian community. So I was interested in sharing those, I was interested in exploring those and preserving those. And that's basically how I started working on the project. I want to say a little bit about the cover. A lot of you know Handala, this character, the symbol of the Palestinian refugee child. So he was, if you don't know about Handala, he was created by a Palestinian artist named Naji Al-Ali, and it's basically, he's standing in that same pose that I illustrated my dad standing in that pose on the cover. He has his hands behind his back, and the story behind it is that he will never, we won't see his face in all of Naji Al-Ali's political cartoons. He's standing in this pose, and we will never see his face until Palestinians are able to return to Palestine. And so, Naji Al-Ali was assassinated, and Palestinians still haven't been able to return, and so we haven't seen his face, but in drawing this, it was almost like, in a way, maybe giving a multiplicity of faces, or a multiplicity of different faces to this idea of the Palestinian refugee, which is often even within the Palestinian community, people look at them through a lens of pity or a subject of pity, and this project for me was kind of about saying, no, these are not objects of pity, these are individuals with individual lives and subjects of their own story, and each story is important, and we need to value and recognize those stories and those multiplicity of stories. Just really quick, this is like the map from the beginning of the book, but all of the stories in the book are true stories. I maybe embellished them, or I maybe put them in slightly different orders in order to communicate different themes or, make the story make a little bit more sense, but there's nothing, like none of the stories are fabricated. They're all things that really happened to my family. It starts off with like a little brief background about my family. My family's from a village in northern Palestine called Safsaf. It's on the map there. And it was ethnically cleansed in 1948 on October 30th. The Israeli army came into the village and killed a lot of the men, and my grandfather was not in the village at the time. He was working. And so people started leaving the village, but my grandmother stayed and waited for him to come back from work. And then when he came back from traveling, they had to flee because they were afraid that the army was going to come back and kill more people. So they fled to Lebanon and eventually ended up in Baddawi camp, and that's where the whole story kind of starts, with my dad in the camp. I wanted to talk, going back to this image, a little bit about some of the visual tropes or themes that I used and why I used them. So there's a little note in the beginning of the book that talks about like the use of tatriz, the Palestinian traditional embroidery, and I used that like on the buildings here. You can see I integrated it into a lot of the illustrations. And the reason I use this is kind of related to this image here in a weird way. I'm gonna like kind of make a circle and come back to it, but so a lot of what I was doing was asserting asserting ownership over Palestinian culture in a very intentional way, because part of what Israel does through its ethnic cleansing, not only of like physical removal of people from the space, killing of people, but also like cultural appropriation. So a lot of what I was doing with the book was intentionally asserting ownership over just different aspects of Palestinian culture, and so using the tatriz in that way was one way of doing that. Also, like in this panel, I wanted to use as an example because I'm talking about za'atar, and it's such a simple thing, but it's such a central part of Palestinian cuisine in a lot of ways. And so just like asserting ownership of that culture in a really intentional way was really important to me when I was writing the book, as well as asserting ownership over histories, because Palestinians, after we got ethnically cleansed, it's almost like, there's a diaspora and people move into all these different countries, and Palestinians become part of the history of those countries, and so the histories of those countries in a way also become the history of the Palestinians, especially in the case of Lebanon during the Civil War, when Palestinians and the Palestinian issue was so central to all of that. So it's not only Lebanese history, it's also Palestinian history. And so like giving, like for example in this panel, this is a really well-known incident that kind of is known to have sparked the Civil War, where this when phalangists attacked this bus full of Palestinians. And that's a well-known story, but giving it a like more personal dimension of like what happened on that day, what my dad was doing on that day, is kind of a way of asserting, in a strange way, asserting ownership over that history. And through this whole process, like history was really important as well, and just like very intentionally writing our own history in a way that kind of subverts, I was trying to subvert like a lot of what the common kinds of rhetoric you see, which leads me to this issue of these shadows that I use throughout the book. I use silhouettes in a lot of different ways, but one of the ways I used them was to illustrate soldiers, in particular Israeli soldiers. And part of the reason for that was also kind of the same reason that I was, doing all this stuff with history and trying to write the history and, take the opportunity to, if we as Palestinians are writing our own history, how do we do that? How do we what kind of rhetoric do we use? How do we write that in our way? And part of that for me was also not making any attempt to humanize Israeli soldiers. I think there's a lot of artwork that does that already, and there's a lot of that in the media, and there's a lot of that, sympathizing with them, making excuses for the kinds of atrocities that were committed. And as a Palestinian, I don't feel that it's my job to humanize the people who are oppressing my people, and so I really intentionally just didn't even want to touch that. I'm telling my father's story, I'm telling the story of the Palestinians, and again, writing a really intentionally writing the history in a specific way, because we never get to write our own history. Other people always write it for us. And so that was all wrapped into those decisions artistically. I wanted to also take a minute to just talk about this panel in particular right here. This panel took a long time to figure out. I was stuck on it and I couldn't figure out how to do it. It was important because at the end of the book, if you guys have read it or if you haven't, I mean, it's probably no surprise, I'm here. So at the end of the book, my dad leaves Lebanon, he comes to the United States. And so I didn't want people to read that book and think, oh, he lost whatever, he left. It's like some kind of American dream story. I didn't want it, that was the last thing, I didn't want it to be read in that way. And so this panel was important because it was going to determine basically how the ending of the book was perceived. And so what this panel means for me anyways, I don't know, I have this idea that for a lot of Palestinians in the diaspora, Palestine is as I drew it on there, literally I drew it as the sun on the horizon. And the reason it's like that is because, wherever you go, the sun or the moon, it always follows you. It doesn't change position. It's always there on the horizon. It's a constant, but you can never reach it. It's always just out of reach. It's just always there, in your mind, in the back of your mind, but you can never get to it. And for a lot of Palestinians, that's what Palestine is, and that's what the idea of return is. It's always there. It's always something you're striving towards, but it's always out of reach, or it always seems out of reach. And so this last page was important because, like I said, I didn't want people to see it as some kind of American dream story. This last page was really about, he could go to the United States or he could stay in Lebanon, but it doesn't matter, whichever path, all the roads lead to Palestine at the end of the day. And so that was kind of the idea behind that panel. And like I said, I kind of struggled with it a lot before I could get to it, get it right. So that was one panel I struggled with. But it's important because the right of return is essential to, refugee issues, and sometimes it's overlooked or forgotten, and we really can't forget about it, and we can't forget about how central it is to the Palestinian struggle in a lot of ways. So that was pretty fast, but that's pretty much all I had. Those are some photographs from my family, my grandparents toasting bread on the space heater, because that's what you do, and my dad in Beirut. And then that picture with the yellow door is my family's house in Baddawi camp. I took it over the summer when I was there. And I don't know, I could talk a little more about that, I guess, but just being, I hadn't really spent much time in Lebanon before when I turned, maybe 15. That was the first time I ever, got to go and meet my family. And it was cool because when I was initially writing this stuff and drawing it, I was having a really hard time conceptualizing a lot of places, and being able to spend time with my family and be in Lebanon, it really made a difference in the way I was able to illustrate street scenes or add more detail and architecture and those kinds of things. So being in Lebanon and with my family and stuff really helped me a lot, just even in terms of just drawing the street scenes, because there's a lot of stuff that you don't know really how to illustrate properly until you're like there and you feel it out and you like have a sense of what it feels like to walk around. So yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. If you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. But yeah.
So you're working in the realm of the graphic novel, which has emerged as being one of the most important ways of communicating histories and stories. I'm curious which graphic novels inform this particular work. Obviously, there are probably several of them. Maybe you made some aesthetic choices, maybe some narrative or political choices based on a few. You could say, for example, Persepolis is one thing, but Joe Sacco's another. It has very different styles and very different structures. So,
I wouldn't say there's one that influenced me the most. I know actually one thing that I did do, I have like a book of Najib Ali's work, and I kept referring to it just because like his symbolism is really, he uses really rich symbolism, and his political comics are really powerful. So sometimes if I was stuck on an idea, I would kind of just like flip through it for inspiration. And I don't know, like if I would say that, but I don't know if I would say that like one graphic novel like really influenced me, but I do like the really stark black and white. I think it's really communicative, and you can get a lot of emotion out of it because you're working within a really limited color palette, so you have to be a little more creative in the way you do things when you have limited. When you limit yourself in one way, it kind of opens the door in another way because you limit yourself to certain, 2 colors, for example, and then you're like, okay, well, how can I like solve this problem? I would normally need to like use color to express that, but how can I express it with just these 2 colors? So that's like an aesthetic that I really like, but that's again like a common aesthetic throughout a lot of graphic novels and comics, so I don't know.